Hey, in this video, I'm going to talk about a really common cognitive distortion and what you can do about it. So stay tuned for a discussion of emotional reasoning, what it is, how people generally approach it, and how my approach actually differs from the traditional one. Stay tuned. Welcome to Wellness with John. I'm John Peters, and these are resources to help you thrive. So in this video, I want to talk about emotional reasoning because it's an issue that comes up basically for everybody on the planet a lot of the time. And it's something that you're going to be well served to understand because it happens to you, it happens to me, it happens to everybody. And we need to know how to work with it in order to turn down the negative influence that emotional reasoning has on how we perceive things and how we respond to things, especially challenges and interpersonal conflicts. Okay. So, what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to talk about what emotional reasoning is, and I'm going to explain kind of the traditional approach to dealing with it. And then I'm going to explain my approach because my approach is different than what a lot of people do with it. And if you Google the topic emotional reasoning, you'll see what people say about the traditional approach. But my approach actually is different from that. And I actually think it's better. Of course, I'm me. So, of course, I think my approach is better. But I'm going to explain why I think that's true because there's a reason that I think that. And then I'm going to explain to you how you can work with it. So I'll give you some practical advice about actual practical strategies to work with emotional reasoning when it happens to you. Okay. So first, let's talk about what emotional reasoning is. And in order to do that, I first want to just say, what is reasoning, right? Because if we're going to talk about emotional reasoning, we have to define reasoning just so that we can understand how emotions are affecting reasoning, right? So reasoning basically is just using your rational mind in some coherent, logical, sequential way so that you reason through some perceptions or things you're thinking about. So there's a whole branch of philosophy that examines what is reasoning, but we're not going to get too deep in this video. But think about it this way. Let's say that I have 2 bowls of ice cream in front of me. And in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, so I'm facing a choice, and the choice is eat ice cream or not. Maybe avoiding it would be better for my health, but I want to enjoy the ice cream. And there's this bowl of chocolate ice cream and a bowl of vanilla ice cream. And I generally like chocolate better, so I'm going to eat the chocolate ice cream. Okay. So we may not necessarily think about that. I mean, you may just see the bowls on the table and just grab the chocolate ice cream and not really think about your thinking about the ice cream. But actually, if we examine it, that process is going on. We call that a reasoning process, okay? We're not talking about emotions here, although, of course, we can think, well, yeah, if I like the ice cream, I'm going to enjoy it. So I predict those emotions and maybe I feel those emotions. But in this example, we're not really talking about how emotions are impacting the reasoning process, right? But the reality is that in lots of situations, emotions impact reasoning. And the reason that we think this is that emotions are powerful ways that our mentation, so the state of our mind, is influenced. And some particular ways that emotions influence our state of mind that impacts reasoning is that when we feel emotions, emotions do a number of things with our mental state. And one of the things that emotions will do is emotions promote behaviors and bring us toward things like I like the ice cream, I feel good about the ice cream, and my emotion related to the ice cream is going to draw me toward the decision to eat it. Or emotions might inhibit behaviors, right? So, oh, I'm afraid of that situation, so I'm just going to avoid it. I'm going to go away from it, right? So emotions promote behaviors, emotions inhibit behaviors. But emotions also direct attention, right? So if I have an emotional reaction to object A, B, and C, let's say there's a bowl of ice cream and a rock and a bowl of sawdust, right? I might feel more desirable emotions related to the ice cream. And what's going to happen is that my brain is actually going to target the target of the desirable emotions, the bowl of ice cream, to the exclusion of other things. So our brain is always selecting what to pay attention to and what to ignore. You can't pay attention to everything that your brain possibly could perceive in any given moment, or you'd be overwhelmed. Life would be like that boat ride in the Willy Wonka movie, right? Chaotic and disorganized. So one of the ways that our brain keeps things organized and coherent and manageable is that our brain does selective attention, right? Which is why you sometimes, if you're shopping for a new car and you've settled on a particular model of a car, you start seeing those cars everywhere, right? Before you got fixated on having that desire for that particular car, you didn't necessarily see them that often. But after you develop this emotional desire for this particular car, suddenly you're seeing them everywhere. And it's not because there are more of the cars, it's because of selective attention. Your emotional self is actually creating a way of selecting attention so that you are fixating on the things associated with that emotion, right? So emotions do that. Emotions also can influence the glue that glues us into certain targets. So, one of the best examples for this is if you've ever had a friend who's gone through a breakup and they won't shut up talking about the breakup for like 6 straight months, all day, every day. That's not because it's constructive to focus on the breakup that way. It's because the breakup and all the different elements of that experience are extremely highly emotionally laden. And so the emotion of that experience is actually impacting the glue that glues that person's attention into what we call the targets. So the elements of that situation that they're experiencing, their misery and their victimhood and how evil, stupid, and crazy their ex is, whatever it happens to be. So emotions have significant impacts on the quality of our mentation. And our perception is not in this raw kind of computer way. We're not just recording information like this video camera I'm using today. We're not just recording information like when I save my Word document on my computer. Our brain does a lot of active selection of what to pay attention to and selection of how to pay attention to, selection of how to process what we're paying attention to. And as I said, what we're drawn toward, what we're inhibited from. And we could go into this more deeply. There are other ways that emotions impact mentation, but that's a good basic understanding of how emotions influence mentation. Now, it's a tricky thing, partly because emotions and thoughts co-arise. We sometimes want to think about it as a one-directional kind of thing, like I thought this and it made me happy, okay? So thought and then emotion. Or, oh, I felt really sad today, and then I started thinking all sorts of dire, catastrophic thoughts, okay? Emotions precede the thoughts. Sometimes we can view things in that neat way where we see that one-directional kind of sequence, but in reality, if you get good at self-awareness and paying attention to your emotional life and your rational aspect of your life, what we notice is that emotions and thoughts kind of co-arise together. So when I'm in a situation, let's say with the ice cream, if I really look at it closely, it's not just that I feel good about ice cream and then that leads me to think certain things, or that I see the bowl of ice cream like Spock or Data would on Star Trek in a very rational mode, and then I feel emotions about the ice cream, okay? The emotions and the thoughts co-arise together. This is all fine a good part of the time. This is why emotions are here in the first place. So let me take a second and tell you where emotions came from, okay? So this is the John version based on this stuff that I study and my framework of thinking about things from an evolutionary psychology mode, okay? So we can't interview non-human animals easily, and we can't get in a time machine and go back in time. But here's one way to think about where emotions came from and why they function the way that they do in our mentation, the way that I was just describing. So many millions of years ago, this is before the dinosaurs even, okay? If you look at the archaeological record, you have the development in what we call morphology, the systems of bodies, of the structures that make up the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is all of the different glands that connect into our nervous system, or especially our central nervous system. So your adrenal glands, your amygdala, your hypothalamus, your thalamus, your pituitary gland. Okay, so you have all of these glands, and they make up the endocrine system. And if you go backward in time, the rudimentary forms of the endocrine system showed up actually hundreds of millions of years ago. So it's not a new thing. And even at the time of the onset of the dinosaurs, this development was already underway. Now, today, thinking about where feelings come from and where emotions come from, we pin feelings and emotions to a significant degree on the endocrine system because we think that the endocrine system and all those hormones that those glands kick out, where they affect our body, they affect our brain, they affect each other, we think that that's integral to the production of the experience that we call feelings. So when I say I feel anxious or I feel happy, I feel sad, what I'm pointing to is certain phenomena in my experience in terms of what I'm having a sense of inside of me, but the things that I'm having a sense of are significantly impacted by the state of my mind and my body, my brain, the endocrine system, and all of that, okay? So I'm not just imagining the feelings with my brain, like, again, to use the Star Trek example, like the holodeck, creating the Matrix, I'm actually having feelings. When I say I feel anxious, I feel sad, or some things like that, those are real feelings, and they are for you too, okay? And what produces those feelings? Well, an extremely complex set of inner changes and states that are going on that are not only mediated by our brains, but mediated by the different chemical mixes that are going on with the different hormones that are getting kicked out by your endocrine system, okay? So, so the endocrine system is the mechanism, along with our brain, that mediates feelings and emotions, right? And the idea from evolutionary psychology is that not only was the endocrine system, advantageous because it had some functions that are different from what I'm talking about today, like metabolism, for example, conserving energy and regulating bodily functions and things like that. But the endocrine system would have had survival value if it helped do those things that I was mentioning before, okay? There's survival value in sufficiently selecting and fixating on a target that might be a food source or a source of danger, right? And so the idea from evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology is that for hundreds of millions of years, organisms needed to find food, needed to procreate, and needed to not get eaten, okay, and killed. And so all of the systems in our body are designed to do those three things. And so the endocrine system had pressure through the process of natural selection to develop in the way that it is developed in us and other animals, so that it supported those three functionings to survive, to eat desirable foods, and to procreate, okay? So those three basic functions are basically driven nonstop 24 hours a day for all organisms, whether you're thinking about it or not. And the onset and development and culmination of our endocrine system and the feelings and emotions that are kind of the way we think about it in experience, all of that really came about as integral to those three basic functions, okay? So, so today, this is all going to make some sense, hopefully, here in a second. So today we're talking about emotional reasoning. And the traditional view, if you go Google the topic and you look at discussion about this, basically the most most of the discussions about emotional reasoning are talking about this in the context of dysfunctional psychology. So if you're my client and I'm your therapist and I say, hey, you're doing emotional reasoning, typically that discussion comes up in the context of some situation where the way that you're perceiving it, dealing with it, reacting to it, working with it internally is happening in a way that your emotions are actually kind of making your reasoning veer off course, okay? And, let me give you an example of that. So let's say that I get into an argument with my coworker at work, and I get really, really angry at my coworker. And so as a result of my anger, the contribution of that strong emotion causes me to perceive my coworker now as this evil person. Okay. Now, again, in my mind, I'm going to argue with anybody who pushes against that. And I might say, but they are evil. And here's the evidence of that, right? But the reality in a lot of situations is the assignment of the status of evil on the person and even the things that we use to support maintaining that appraisal of the person, those things are heavily influenced by the emotion, okay? So the traditional view tends to identify the times where that is tripping people up the most. And if you look at what happens when people get most mired in the worst presentation of emotional reasoning, it's usually when people are in a chronic, long-lasting situation where they've developed very negative, unworkable, inflexible perceptions of a person or a situation or of themselves, and the significant cognitive distortion that maintains that is that the person is not reality testing. Okay, so let me explain what reality testing is. Reality testing is when we have some perception and then we end up deciding that that perception is provisional, that it may be true, but it might not be true, and we might need to revise it or investigate it more. And we're going to examine it in some meaningful way so that we then accommodate or adapt what we're perceiving, how we're rationalizing about the thing to use still subjective but somewhat objective data about the thing. Okay, that's very abstract, I know, but let me give you an example to make that clear. So let's say I do get mad at someone and I'm thinking they're an effing jerk, okay? But then I calm down enough to be able to reality test and I say, well, yeah, I don't like what they did, and I'm really going to negotiate with them about that, or I'm going to confront them about it. But it's not really about them being a bad person. It's that I don't like what they did. The consequences of their actions were very miserable for me, and I'm not even sure they had good intent. And so I'm going to work with this. But through that kind of shift of awareness, we're doing reality testing to the degree that we're considering additional data beyond, and by data, I even mean thoughts in our own head, not necessarily that we're going doing research on something to get more outside objective data, but we're considering additional elements that we can contemplate and introduce into the rational process that cause us to have a more workable view of objective reality of the situation so that we have a more effective response pattern, okay? Reality testing also sometimes talked about when we talk about someone becoming delirious or delusional or psychotic. Sometimes people believe something and it's just not objectively true, and yet they really perceive it that way and they believe it that way and they get committed to that perception. And so we try to help people in those states to reality test so that they can, for example, tell the difference between an auditory hallucination and someone actually saying something to them, right? So reality testing matters as a corrective thing for emotional reasoning, because when we are more steered, veering off course, with our objective appraisal of a situation, and we're doing that because of emotional reactions and the influence of emotions on our perceptions, reality testing is the way to reduce the negative effects of the emotional reasoning. Because when we think more clearly through something, and this is why therapy helps when people just talk through their problems, or why when you go talk to a friend or a family member, often what happens in those conversations is a synergistic reality testing, because you're voicing your perceptions and your thoughts about something, how you're working with something, and the feedback you get, even if the other person doesn't say anything, the feedback you get from their body language or whatever actually helps you have a more objective view of whatever it is you're focused on or whatever you're working through. Okay, so emotional reasoning is more complex than what I'm describing, and reality testing is not the only thing to do to correct for it, but it is the most central thing, and it's an essential thing. And again, if you want richer understanding of what emotional reasoning is, you can Google it, and you can also just understand what are the types of things people use to try to work with cognitive distortions. But reality testing is essential, because if we don't reality test effectively, then we are not going to be able to correct for the worst ways that emotional reasoning shows up and skews the way we perceive things and think about things and react to things. Okay. So the thing about reality testing as it relates to emotional reasoning is that we know that when anxiety is higher, that we are worse at doing reality testing. Okay. So people who have chronic anxiety, like generalized anxiety disorder or any other type of chronic anxiety issue like OCD, PTSD, one of the things that we know is that because people are sustaining an elevated state of anxiety, that people who are more elevated with anxiety tend to do reality testing less of the time and less efficiently. Okay. So we know that anxiety and reality testing are related. And this is why my approach to helping people correct for the cognitive distortions that come about through emotional reasoning is different from probably what you'll see if you go Google the term, because the traditional approach with emotional reasoning and what to do about it tends to identify the worst forms of it and then point to the sources of when did that come about, right? And this is not surprising, because psychology is still heavily influenced by psychoanalytic theory, which basically says past experiences get introjected into our psyche and then we carry them along. So what you might find is people recommending that if you're having emotional reasoning, that you go do inner child work, or you try to work out, how things affected you in the past. And I don't want to completely poo-poo that, but I think that one of the limitations of the conventional approaches in psychology is that there's too much reliance on that to the exclusion of other ways to view some of the processes that can be used to work through therapeutic goals. And some of the other stuff I think is very helpful, which is why I say my approach to this is different, because my approach certainly can examine that kind of more deep core kind of stable emotional reasoning that can come about, let's say, through past trauma or something. But we all do emotional reasoning. You do, I do, everybody does. And so if we all do it a fair amount of the time, and it's potentially disruptive to how we perceive things and work with things and react with things, then what can we know about how it works so that we can all actually reduce the negative impacts of it? So for me, the important part is the connection between our anxiety level and the potential for not reality testing or having suboptimal perceptions. So when anxiety is up at high code orange or code red, the fact is our brain is skewed. Your brain goes into a different mode when you're turned up to 11 with your stress level. And that mode is good at saving you from being eaten by a giant bear, but it's not that good at helping you make sense of and negotiate a lot of the types of stress that you experience, let's say an argument with a coworker, okay? When you get super stressed out in your conflict with your coworker and your brain goes into, I'm about to get eaten by a bear mode, there's certain types of brain changes that are going to change your perception, your appraisal, your rational process as you're trying to respond effectively to that situation of conflict. Part of that is emotional reasoning, okay? So for me, the best way to have a general positive influence on that type of thing is to learn how to work with stress. Because if it's true that higher stress potentiates more negative thinking in lots of ways, including the stuff I've talked about in this video, then we can correct for that by just lowering our stress level. Now, I know you may be saying, okay, John, that's easy to say, but where's the button that I hit to lower my stress level? Because in those situations, you get triggered and you don't feel like that's in your control. And it may not be immediately in your control unless you learn effectively to do things to learn how to come down from a stress trigger. The good news is you can learn those. You can work with a therapist who works like me in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and we can teach you lots of effective things, right, to do that. But for me, the basic thing that's important to do is actually lower your general stress level. If your general stress level is lower, then when you get triggered, you won't trigger up as high. And if you're doing the things that I recommend to lower your general stress level, those techniques also rewire your brain so that you also reset back down to your non-stressed baseline after a trigger more readily, meaning you get flipped out and then you unflip yourself more readily, right? And by the way, let me just pause and say, if you're interested in more information about these types of topics, check out other videos on this channel. And if you're interested in working with me as a coach to learn these techniques, regardless of whether you're experiencing frank psychiatric distress or a mental health issue, I teach these techniques as a coach. I'll put the link down in the description of my coaching services page if you want to check out more information about that, right? So just a quick plug on my services that I offer around working with these types of things. But back to the topic at hand. So for me, the most effective thing you can do is mindful breathing. And the reason for that is mindful breathing actually not only soothes you and teaches you how to calm down from a stress trigger, but mindful breathing, if you do it the way that I recommend, actually rewires your brain so that even when you're not practicing, you're actually in a stress-proof mode. So you're not as likely to trigger up as high on the stress scale when you get triggered. You're going to reset back down more readily, and you're generally going to fly along at a lower baseline anxiety level. And that is actually going to help you, even without thinking about it, even without identifying, okay, now I'm emotional reasoning, and I'm getting fixated on something and thinking about it in a super negative way, and it's influenced by my emotions. Even if you never have a thought like that, if you're practicing mindful breathing daily the way I prescribe, you're actually just going to do less of that more negative type of emotional reasoning, right? So if you want the simplest way without having to think about it too much and without having to go to therapy and talk about your inner child for 5 years, just do some mindful breathing. And it really does work that way because, as I said, I've been practicing in this field for 26 years. Before I became a therapist, I did a decade of intense personal study and practice of these things. And so I've got over 3 decades of experience and over 10,000 patients and clients and students that I've taught this to. And it really does work that way. So if you want to learn about how to do mindful breathing, I'll put a link up here at the top right now for a video that I did that just teaches the basic technique. So if you just do that, you're going to notice that you do less emotional reasoning, which you're going to notice now that you've watched this video and you understand what emotional reasoning is, right? So if you like this kind of content, hit the like button below. I love comments. Please comment if you have something that you'd like to share related to this video. And if you have yet to subscribe to the channel, please subscribe to be apprised of upcoming videos. And I know you have lots of things to do with your time, so I really deeply appreciate you taking a minute to join me here in this video today, and I will see you in a future video.